The mahogany gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the dimly lit parlour of the Henderson estate. Margaret Thompson stood frozen in the corner, her hands trembling as she watched her own family debate her worth like cattle at market. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of trying, 7 years of whispered prayers and broken dreams, and now, because she couldn't give her late husband an heir, they were literally putting a price on her head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Do I hear 2,000 for the Thompson widow? Her brother-in-law's voice boomed across the room, filled with strangers and distant relatives, all eager to claim her dead husband's fortune. But what they didn't know was that someone else had been watching from the shadows, someone who would change everything with 5 simple words that would echo through her soul forever. The morning had started like any other in the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, but Margaret Thompson knew it would end with her life completely shattered. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the legal documents that had arrived 3 days ago, the words blurring through her tears. Estate settlement and asset distribution, the header read in cold, formal print. Her name appeared exactly 3 times in the 12-page document, and each mention made her stomach turn. Margaret had married Robert Thompson when she was 19, full of dreams and hope for the future. Robert owned the largest grain mill in 3 counties, and their wedding had been the talk of Millbrook. The whole town had celebrated, convinced they were witnessing the beginning of a dynasty. The Thompsons were old money, respected, influential. Margaret had felt like the luckiest woman alive. But 7 years had passed, and those dreams had withered like autumn leaves. Month after month, year after year, she and Robert had hoped for children. They'd consulted doctors in Cincinnati, traveled to specialists in Chicago, tried every remedy the town's elderly women suggested. Nothing worked. The whispers started after the 3rd year. By the 5th year, even Robert's family had begun treating her with barely concealed disappointment. By the 7th year, the looks of pity had turned to something much worse. Then Robert died suddenly of a heart attack at 42, leaving behind a vast fortune and a widow who, according to his family, had failed in her most basic duty as a wife. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago, and Margaret had barely had time to grieve before the lawyers descended like vultures. The Thompson family had always been shrewd with money, but Margaret never imagined they could be this cruel. Robert's will had been clear. Everything went to his wife. But there was an old provision in the family charter, a clause dating back to the 1800s that the current generation had decided to invoke. If a Thompson heir died without children and left everything to a spouse who had proven barren, the family could contest the inheritance through what they euphemistically called family arbitration. Margaret had laughed when the lawyer first explained it. Surely this was some archaic nonsense that no modern court would uphold, but her laughter died when she realized they weren't planning to go to court. They were planning something far worse. The arbitration was scheduled for tonight, in the very parlor where she and Robert had celebrated their engagement. The family had invited distant relatives, business associates, and anyone else who might have a financial interest in the Thompson estate. They would present their case for why Margaret was unfit to inherit, and then they would auction off her guardianship to whoever would pay the most for the privilege of controlling her and the fortune. It was medieval, it was barbaric. And apparently it was perfectly legal under the obscure family charter that Robert's great-great-grandfather had established. Margaret walked through her house, touching the furniture she would likely never see again, running her fingers along the mantelpiece where her wedding photo still stood. She and Robert looked so young, so hopeful. She wondered what he would think of his family's plan. Part of her believed he would have stopped this madness, but another part, the part that remembered his growing distance in those final years, wasn't so sure. Her sister-in-law, Patricia Henderson, had been the architect of this scheme. Patricia had always resented Margaret's position in the family, especially since Patricia's own son had been born with a weak constitution and would never be able to run the family businesses. Patricia had married into the Henderson banking family, but she'd never forgotten that she'd once hoped to marry Robert herself. "It's nothing personal, Margaret," Patricia had said when she'd delivered the legal papers personally. "But family comes first. The Thompson name and fortune need to be protected by someone who understands their value, someone who can ensure the legacy continues." Margaret had wanted to scream that she'd loved Robert more than any of them ever had, that she'd tried everything to give him children, that her worth as a person shouldn't be measured by her fertility. Instead, she'd nodded politely and asked Patricia to leave. Now, as evening approached, Margaret dressed carefully in her navy blue dress, the one Robert had always said brought out her eyes. If she was going to face this humiliation, she would. Do it with whatever dignity she could muster. The Henderson estate sat on a hill overlooking Millbrook, its imposing brick facade lit by gas lamps that cast dancing shadows across the circular drive. Margaret's hands shook as she climbed the front steps, knowing that by morning her life would belong to someone else entirely. The parlor was packed with familiar faces wearing unfamiliar expressions. Men she'd served tea to in her own home now looked at her with calculating eyes, as if assessing her potential value. Women who'd once called her friend whispered behind their fans, their gazes a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. Patricia's husband, Charles Henderson, stood at the front of the room beside a makeshift podium. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to conducting business, even business as distasteful as this. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight to resolve a matter of family honor and financial responsibility," he began, his words echoing off the high ceiling. "As you know, Robert Thompson passed away recently, leaving behind a considerable estate, but no direct heir. While his widow is by all accounts a decent woman, the family believes that such a substantial inheritance requires management by someone with the business acumen and family connections necessary to preserve the Thompson legacy." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. They were talking about her as if she weren't standing right there, as if she were incapable of understanding their intentions. Charles continued, "Therefore, in accordance with the Thompson family charter, established in 1847, we will now entertain offers for the guardianship of Mrs. Margaret Thompson and the management of her inheritance. The winning bidder will assume full legal and financial responsibility for her welfare, with the understanding that they will also gain control of the Thompson assets." The room buzzed with murmurs as men leaned toward each other, discussing strategy and pricing. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to pretend she was somewhere else, anywhere else. "Do I hear an opening bid of $500? Charles called out. "1,000! Came a voice from near the fireplace. Margaret opened her eyes to see Harold Whitman, the town's undertaker, raising his hand with a greasy smile. The irony wasn't lost on her. 1,500! Countered Jonas Bradley, who owned the lumber mill. He was a widower in his 60s, with grown children, who'd made it clear they considered Margaret's inheritance a welcome addition to their family's holdings. 2,000, called Patricia herself, apparently not content to simply orchestrate the event. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized her sister-in-law intended to buy her like a prize cow. The bidding continued, each number feeling like a nail in the coffin of Margaret's independence. She watched the faces around her, memorizing each one, wondering how people she'd considered friends could participate in something so degrading. The amounts climbed steadily. 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. Margaret began to feel dizzy as the realization hit her that these weren't just symbolic bids. Someone would actually pay this money tonight, and tomorrow she would wake up as their property, "Do I hear 6,000? Charles called out, his gavel ready to fall. The room fell silent. Patricia was the highest bidder at 5,500, and her triumphant smile made Margaret's stomach churn. She was about to become her sister-in-law's servant, dependent on Patricia's goodwill for every meal, every piece of clothing, every basic necessity. Charles raised his gavel. Going once for 5,500 to Mrs. Patricia Henderson. Margaret closed her eyes again, trying to accept her fate with grace. Going twice. The gavel began its descent toward the wooden block. $10,000. The voice came from the back of the room, deep and unfamiliar. Every head turned as a tall figure stepped out of the shadows near the doorway. Margaret had never seen him before, but something about his bearing suggested he wasn't a man to be taken lightly. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room with a single glance. His suit was well-tailored, but not flashy, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way without raising his voice. Patricia's face had gone pale. "I'm sorry, but who are you exactly?" "This is a private family matter." The stranger smiled, but there was steel behind it. "My name is Daniel Crawford. I'm an attorney from Chicago, and I have a legitimate interest in this proceeding." Charles frowned. "What sort of interest?" "The sort that comes with being able to pay cash tonight," Daniel replied calmly. $10,000, as stated. I need to repeat myself. The room erupted in whispers. 10,000 was twice Patricia's bid, and more than most of the men present made in 2 years. Margaret found herself staring at Daniel Crawford, wondering what possible interest he could have in her situation. Charles looked flustered. Well, that is... Do you understand the terms of the arrangement? This isn't simply a business transaction. You would be assuming guardianship of Mrs. Thompson. "I understand perfectly," Daniel said, his eyes finding Margaret's across the crowded room. For a moment, she felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. "The question is whether you're prepared to accept my bid, or if you'd prefer to continue with this charade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Patricia stepped forward, her composure cracking. "This is highly irregular. We don't know anything about you, Mr. Crawford. For all we know, you could be a confident man or worse." Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I have letters of credit from 3 banks in Chicago, along with character references from some of Illinois' most prominent citizens. I can provide whatever documentation you require, but I should mention that my offer has an expiration time." He pulled out a gold pocket watch and checked it with theatrical precision. "I'm prepared to pay $10,000 in cash tonight, but only for the next 5 minutes. After that, I'll assume you're not serious about conducting business, and I'll take my money elsewhere." Margaret watched this exchange with growing amazement. This complete stranger was offering to pay a fortune for the right to control her life, and she couldn't begin to understand why. What did he want from her? What did he know that she didn't? Charles and Patricia huddled together in urgent conversation, while the rest of the room waited in tense silence. Finally, Charles returned to his podium, his face flushed with excitement and confusion. "Mr. Crawford, your bid is unexpected. Before we can proceed, I must ask, what are your intentions regarding Mrs. Thompson?" "The family wants assurance that she'll be treated with appropriate care and respect." Daniel's laugh was short and humorless. "With all due respect, Mr. Henderson, the family's concern for Mrs. Thompson's welfare seems rather selective. But to answer your question directly, Mrs. Thompson will be treated with the dignity and respect that any person deserves. She'll want for nothing, and she'll have freedoms that apparently aren't available to her here in Millbrook." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt her heart racing as she tried to process what was happening. This man was offering her an escape from Patricia's control, but at what cost? What would he expect from her in return? Charles looked around the room, clearly hoping someone else would top the bid, but the silence stretched on. Finally, he raised his gavel again. "Do I hear any bids higher than $10,000? The room remained quiet. Even Patricia seemed to realize that 10,000 was beyond her reach. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with finality. Sold to Mr. Daniel Crawford for $10,000. Margaret felt the world spin around her. In the space of a few minutes, her fate had changed completely. She was no longer going to be Patricia's servant, but she was still someone's property. The stranger who had just bought her was walking toward her now, his expression unreadable. When he reached her, he stopped and looked directly into her eyes. Up close, she could see that his face was kinder than she'd first thought, with laugh, lines around his eyes, and a mouth that suggested he smiled often. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her ears. "I know this must be confusing and frightening, but I want you to know that you have nothing to fear from me. I have some things to explain, but not here, not in front of these people." Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why? Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Daniel glanced around the room, where everyone was straining to hear their conversation. "You're right, I don't know you, but I knew your husband, and I made him a promise that I intend to keep." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Charles approached them with a stack of legal documents and a smug expression. "Mr. Crawford, if you'd like to complete the transaction, we have the papers ready for your signature. The $10,000, of course, must be paid tonight." Daniel reached into his jacket again and withdrew a bank draft. "Chicago First National Bank," he said, handing it over. "You can verify the funds tomorrow if you'd like, but I assume you'll find everything in order." Charles examined the draft with obvious amazement. Margaret realized that most of the people in this room had probably never seen that much money at once. As Daniel signed the papers that legally transferred her guardianship to him, Margaret felt numb. Everything was happening so fast that she couldn't process the full implications. One thing was clear: her life in Millbrook was over. Whatever came next, she would face it as Daniel Crawford's ward, dependent on his goodwill and mercy. The legal formalities took another hour to complete. Margaret stood to the side, feeling like a spectator at her own life, as Daniel dealt with the various documents and requirements. Several times she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't the look of a man who'd just purchased a piece of property. It was something else. Something that gave her a small flutter of hope. When everything was finished, Daniel approached her one more time. "Mrs. Thompson, my carriage is waiting outside. I've taken the liberty of arranging accommodation for tonight at the Millbrook Inn. Tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll travel to Chicago, where we can discuss your future in private." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She looked around the parlor one last time, taking in the faces of the people who had been willing to auction her off like livestock. Some looked ashamed now that the deed was done. Others, particularly Patricia, looked furious that their plans had been thwarted. As she walked toward the door with Daniel, she heard Patricia call out, "This isn't over, Crawford. That woman has obligations to this family." Daniel stopped and turned back, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Mrs. Henderson, as of tonight, Mrs. Thompson's only obligation is to herself. I suggest you remember that." The cold October air hit Margaret's face as they stepped outside, and she breathed deeply for the first time in hours. Daniel's carriage was indeed waiting, a well-appointed vehicle with a driver who tipped his hat respectfully when he saw them. As Daniel helped her into the carriage, Margaret finally found the courage to speak. "Mr. Crawford, I need to know what you expect from me, what you want in return for what you've done." Daniel settled into the seat across from her as the carriage began to move. In the dim light from the carriage lamps, his face looked thoughtful and sad. Mrs. Thompson, what I want is to honor a promise I made to a dying man. Your husband wrote to me 6 months before he passed away. He was worried about what would happen to you if he died, worried about his family's intentions. He asked me to watch out for you if anything happened to him. Margaret stared at him in shock. Robert contacted you? But I don't understand. How did he know you? We served together in the war 15 years ago. We saved each other's lives more than once, and we stayed in touch through letters over the years. When he realized his heart was failing, he reached out to old friends, trying to make arrangements for your protection. Tears began to flow down Margaret's face as she realized that Robert had been trying to protect her even as he was dying. But why didn't he tell me? Why keep it secret? Daniel's voice was gentle. He was hoping he'd recover, that he wouldn't need to activate these arrangements. And he was afraid his family might try to prevent him from making provisions for you, if they knew what he was planning. The carriage rolled through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past houses where Margaret had lived her entire life. She was leaving it all behind, but for the first time since Robert's death, she didn't feel completely alone. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel looked out the window at the passing scenery. "Now, Mrs. Thompson, you get to decide what kind of life you want to live. The money I paid tonight was from a fund your husband established specifically for your protection. You're not my property, despite what those legal papers say. You're a free woman who deserves the chance to build whatever future makes you happy." As the carriage pulled up in front of the Millbrook Inn, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with dignity and with the knowledge that she hadn't been forgotten or abandoned. The stranger who had rescued her was helping her down from the carriage now, his hand steady and reassuring. Tomorrow would bring new uncertainties, but tonight, for the first time in months, Margaret Thompson would sleep as a free woman. The innkeeper showed them to adjacent rooms, and as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about Daniel Crawford's final words of the evening. "Rest well, Mrs. Thompson. Tomorrow we begin the real work of setting you free." Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar lace curtains and the sound of carriages passing on cobblestones below. For a moment she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for Robert's side of the bed before reality crashed back. The Millbrook Inn, Daniel Crawford, the auction that had changed everything. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Thompson? It's Daniel. I've taken the liberty of ordering breakfast. Would you join me in the dining room when you're ready?" Margaret's stomach churned with nerves, but she forced herself to respond. "Give me 20 minutes, please." She dressed carefully in her traveling dress, a deep green wool that Robert had bought her for their anniversary 2 years ago. As she pinned up her hair, she studied her reflection in the small mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different, somehow as if the events of last night had fundamentally altered something in her expression. The inn's dining room was nearly empty at this early hour. Daniel sat at a corner table, reading a newspaper and sipping coffee. He stood when he saw her, pulling out her chair with the practiced courtesy of a gentleman. "I hope you slept well," he said, settling back into his seat. "I know yesterday was difficult." Margaret accepted the cup of coffee he poured for her, grateful for something to do with her hands. "Mr. Crawford, I've been thinking all night about what you told me, about Robert contacting you, about the promise you made. I need to understand what this means for my future." Daniel folded his newspaper and set it aside, giving her his full attention. "Of course, you deserve complete honesty." He paused as the innkeeper's wife brought plates of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread. When they were alone again, he continued, "Your husband was more concerned about his family's intentions than he let you know. He'd been investigating that old family charter for months, trying to find a way to protect you from it." Margaret's fork froze halfway to her mouth. He knew they would try this. He suspected. Patricia had made some comments about family responsibility and bloodlines that worried him. When his doctor told him his heart condition was worsening, Robert began making contingency plans. He contacted several of his old army friends, asking us to watch over you if something happened to him. The coffee tasted bitter on Margaret's tongue. So there are other men who agreed to this arrangement. Daniel's expression softened. Margaret, may I call you Margaret? The arrangement isn't what you think it is. Robert didn't ask us to control your life or make decisions for you. He asked us to ensure you had options, real choices. I don't understand. Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. This is the letter he wrote to me 6 months ago. I think you should read it. Margaret's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Robert's familiar handwriting covered 2 pages of cream-colored stationery. My dear friend Daniel, if you are reading this letter, then my worst fears have been realized, and I am no longer alive to protect the woman I love more than life itself. Margaret doesn't know I'm writing to you, and I pray she never needs to know. But if my family attempts to invoke the old charter against her, then please, for the sake of our friendship and everything we went through together, help her. Margaret is the strongest, kindest, most intelligent woman I have ever known. The fact that we were not blessed with children is not her fault, though she blames herself. I fear my family will use this against her, will try to paint her as somehow deficient or unworthy. Nothing could be further from the truth. I have established a fund in your name at Chicago First National Bank. The account contains enough money to purchase Margaret's freedom from whatever scheme my family devises, and enough beyond that to ensure she can live independently for the rest of her life. I'm not asking you to marry her or control her. I am asking you to give her what I cannot, the chance to choose her own path. Margaret has always wanted to see the world beyond Millbrook. She has dreams of opening a school, of helping other women gain the education and independence that society so often denies them. She is brilliant with numbers and has helped me manage the mill's finances for years, though she would never take credit for her contributions. Please don't let my family destroy her spirit. She deserves so much more than they will ever understand. Your grateful friend Robert Thompson. Margaret read the letter twice before looking up at Daniel, tears streaming down her face. He really knew what they would do. Robert loved you deeply, Margaret. Everything he wrote about you, everything he hoped for your future, it all came through in his words. He wanted me to make sure you understood that. The weight of Robert's final gift settled over her like a warm blanket. Even in death, he had been trying to protect her, to give her the freedom to become the woman she'd always dreamed of being. This money you paid last night, she said slowly. That was from Robert, Daniel nodded. Every penny. And there's more where that came from. Enough to buy you a house wherever you want to live. Enough to start that school he mentioned. Enough to ensure you never have to depend on anyone's charity or goodwill ever again. Margaret set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. The magnitude of Robert's planning, his love for her, his determination to secure her future even from beyond the grave, was overwhelming. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to process this. You don't have to process it all at once, Daniel said gently. We can take things one step at a time. The first step is getting you away from Millbrook and your husband's family. I have a house in Chicago where you can stay as long as you need while you decide what comes next. Your house? Margaret looked at him suspiciously. Mr. Crawford, I may be grateful for your help, but I won't be any man's kept woman. I've had enough of being dependent on male goodwill. Daniel's laugh was warm and genuine. Margaret, I can see why Robert admired you so much. You have nothing to worry about on that score. My house has a separate wing that my housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, uses. You would have complete privacy and independence. I travel frequently for my law practice, so you'd often have the entire place to yourself. You're a lawyer. I am. I specialize in property law and women's rights, actually. It's a growing field, believe it or not. More and more women are finding themselves in situations similar to yours, needing legal protection from families who view them as property rather than people. Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motives. All she saw was sincerity and something that might have been respect. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "I understand you made a promise to Robert, but this goes far beyond any reasonable obligation to a friend." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the busy street beyond. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and sad. 5 years ago, I was engaged to a wonderful woman named Catherine Walsh. She was intelligent, educated, independent. She had her own money and her own opinions, and I loved her for it. But when her father died suddenly, her brothers decided she was unfit to inherit his business. They had her declared mentally incompetent and committed to an asylum. Margaret gasped. "That's horrible. What happened to her?" "I tried to fight it through the courts, but the law wasn't on her side. By the time I found a judge willing to listen, Catherine had been in that place for 8 months. She died of pneumonia 2 weeks before her case was to be heard." The pain in Daniel's voice was raw and immediate, as if Catherine had died yesterday rather than years ago. Margaret felt her heart break for this man who had lost the woman he loved to the same kind of family greed that had nearly destroyed her own life. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Catherine made me promise near the end that I would use my legal knowledge to help other women in similar situations. I've been doing that ever since. When Robert's letter arrived, I knew this was exactly the kind of case Catherine would have wanted me to take." Margaret reached across the table and touched Daniel's hand briefly. "She would be proud of what you're doing." Daniel smiled sadly. "I hope so, and I hope you'll let me help you build the kind of life she never got the chance to have." They finished their breakfast in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Daniel consulted his pocket, watch, and stood. "Our train to Chicago leaves in 2 hours. Are you ready to start your new life?" Margaret looked around the dining room of the inn where she'd spent her last night in Millbrook. In less than 24 hours, everything had changed. She was no longer Robert Thompson's widow, struggling to find her place in a world that had no use for childless women. She was Margaret Thompson, free woman with the resources and opportunity to create whatever future she wanted. "Yes," she said, standing to meet his eyes. "I'm ready." The train station was bustling with travelers, porters, and vendors selling everything from newspapers to hot coffee. Daniel had arranged for a private compartment, giving Margaret space to process the enormity of what was happening. As the train pulled away from Millbrook, she watched her hometown disappear into the distance with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Tell me about Chicago," she said as the countryside rolled past their window. Daniel's face lit up with enthusiasm. "It's unlike anything you've experienced in Millbrook. The city is growing so fast that new buildings go up every week. There are theaters, museums, libraries, with more books than you could read in a lifetime. And the opportunities for women are expanding all the time." "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, there are several women's colleges now, training teachers and nurses. There are women doctors, women lawyers, women who own their own businesses. It's not easy, and there's still plenty of prejudice to overcome, but it's possible in ways it never was before." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. "Robert mentioned that I might want to start a school. I've always loved teaching, but in Millbrook, the school board would never have hired a married woman, much less a childless widow. In Chicago, there are private schools that would welcome someone with your background and intelligence, or you could start your own. With Robert's legacy, you'd have the financial freedom to take risks and follow your passions." The idea was intoxicating. Margaret had spent 7 years of marriage helping Robert manage the mill's complex finances, but she'd never been able to take credit for her contributions. The thought of using those skills openly, of building something entirely her own, made her pulse quicken with anticipation. "What about the legal aspects?" she asked. "Am I truly free now, or could Patricia and her family still cause problems?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "Legally, I am your guardian, under the terms of last night's agreement, but I've already prepared papers transferring that guardianship back to you as soon as we reach Chicago. Illinois has more progressive laws regarding women's property rights. Once you're established there, the Thompson family will have no legal claim on you whatsoever. You're giving up your legal authority over me, just like that. Margaret, I never wanted authority over you. I wanted to free you from people who would misuse that authority. There's a difference." The train clickety-clacked through small towns and farmland as Margaret contemplated this extraordinary turn of events. Yesterday morning, she had been facing a future as Patricia Henderson's servant. Now she was traveling toward a city where she could become anything she wanted to be. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Have you ever considered remarrying, starting a family of your own?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the landscape blur past. "I've thought about it, but I've never met anyone who made me forget Catherine. And frankly, most women of marriageable age are looking for a husband who wants to control their lives, not one who wants to set them free. It seems we both have unconventional ideas about what marriage should be." Margaret smiled at that. "Robert used to say I had too many opinions for my own good. He meant it as a compliment, but his family never saw it that way." "Intelligence and independence aren't flaws, Margaret, no matter what small-minded people might say. In Chicago, you'll find that there are plenty of people who appreciate those qualities in a woman." The train began to slow as they approached a small depot. Daniel consulted his watch again. "We should reach Chicago by evening. Mrs. O'Brien will have dinner waiting for us, and tomorrow you can start exploring the city. There's a women's college just a few blocks from my house. You might want to visit, see what they're doing with their educational programs." Margaret's heart raced with anticipation. For the first time since Robert's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. As the train picked up speed again, she thought about the letter Robert had written to Daniel, about his faith in her abilities and his dreams for her future. She thought about Catherine Walsh, the woman who had died fighting for the same freedoms Margaret was now being offered. And she thought about Daniel Crawford, this unexpected guardian angel who was asking nothing from her except the chance to help her succeed. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Margaret watched it through the compartment window and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that her best days were still ahead of her. "Daniel," she said softly, "there's something I want you to know. Whatever happens in Chicago, whatever I decide to do with my future, I will never forget what you've done for me. You've given me back my life." Daniel turned from his own contemplation of the sunset to meet her eyes. "Margaret, you never lost your life. You just needed the right circumstances to reclaim it. Robert knew that. Catherine knew that. And now you're going to prove it to the world." As the train carried them toward Chicago and toward possibilities Margaret had never dared to imagine, she felt the last of her fears begin to dissolve. She was Margaret Thompson, free woman, and tomorrow she would begin to discover just how much she was capable of achieving. The wheels of the train seemed to echo Daniel's words, "Reclaim it, reclaim it, reclaim it." And for the first time in 7 years, Margaret truly believed she could. Chicago rose from the prairie like a monument to human ambition, its skyline punctuated by smokestacks and church spires reaching toward the darkening sky. Margaret pressed her face to the train window as they approached Union Station, marveling at the sheer scale of the city. She had never seen so many buildings clustered together, never imagined streets could be so wide or filled with such constant motion. "It's overwhelming at first," Daniel said, noticing her wide-eyed expression, "but you'll grow to love it. There's an energy here that you can't find anywhere else." The station itself was a cathedral of iron and glass, filled with the echoes of hundreds of conversations, the hiss of steam engines, and the constant clatter of luggage carts. Margaret stayed close to Daniel as they navigated through the crowd, grateful for his steady presence in this bewildering new world. His carriage was waiting outside, driven by a dignified older man who tipped his hat respectfully when Daniel introduced him as Thomas Murphy. "Thomas has been with my family for 20 years, Daniel explained as they settled into the well-appointed vehicle. "He knows Chicago better than anyone." As they drove through the gaslit streets, Margaret caught glimpses of a city unlike anything she had ever imagined. Elegant department stores with enormous plate-glass windows displayed goods from around the world. Restaurants glowed with warm light, filled with diners dressed in the latest fashions. Women walked alone or in pairs, some carrying briefcases or portfolios, their bearing confident and purposeful. "Those women," Margaret said, pointing discreetly at a group crossing the street. "They look so independent." Daniel followed her gaze and smiled. "Many of them probably are. Chicago has always attracted women who want something more than traditional domesticity. You'll fit right in." Daniel's house occupied an entire corner in a fashionable neighborhood, its red brick facade elegant but not ostentatious. Gas lamps flanked the front door, and Margaret could see warm light glowing in several windows. As Thomas helped her down from the carriage, she felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about this new chapter of her life. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a plump, middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Her dress was practical, but well-made, and she moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a large household. "Mrs. O'Brien," Daniel said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Margaret Thompson. Margaret, this is Mrs. O'Brien, who keeps my house running and my life organized." Mrs. O'Brien's smile was genuine as she extended her hand. "Welcome to Chicago, Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Crawford told me a bit about your situation. You'll find no judgment here, only a safe place to figure out what comes next." The interior of Daniel's house was both masculine and comfortable, with dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling. But it was the small touches that caught Margaret's attention. Fresh flowers in cut crystal vases, embroidered cushions that could only have been made by feminine hands, and photographs that spoke of a life lived fully despite tragedy. "Mrs. O'Brien will show you to your rooms," Daniel said. "The East Wing has its own sitting room and private entrance, so you'll have complete independence. We can discuss your future plans tomorrow, after you've had a chance to rest and orient yourself." Margaret's suite was larger than her entire bedroom back in Millbrook. The sitting room contained a writing desk, positioned near tall windows that looked out onto a small garden. The bedroom was furnished with a 4-poster bed, a wardrobe that could hold 3 times as many clothes as she owned, and a vanity table with a mirror that reflected the soft glow of gas lamps. "I took the liberty of having some basic necessities brought in," Mrs. O'Brien said, opening the wardrobe to reveal several dresses, undergarments, and a warm coat. "I guessed at your size, but we can have everything altered if needed. There's also a bath drawn for you, and I'll bring dinner to your sitting room whenever you're ready." When Mrs. O'Brien left, Margaret sank into the comfortable chair by the window and tried to process the rapid changes in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been facing life as Patricia Henderson's unpaid servant. Now she was sitting, in luxury that exceeded anything she had known even during her marriage, with the promise of enough money to live independently for the rest of her life. The bath was pure indulgence, hot water scented with lavender and rose petals. Margaret soaked until her fingers wrinkled, letting the warmth seep into muscles that had been tense for months. When Mrs. O'Brien knocked with dinner, Margaret felt more relaxed than she had since Robert's death. "Mr. Crawford asked me to give you these," Mrs. O'Brien said, setting down a tray of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables that had clearly been prepared by someone who understood fine cooking. She handed Margaret a small stack of pamphlets and newspapers, information about women's colleges, employment opportunities, and cultural activities in the city. He thought you might want to read through them. Margaret spent the evening poring over materials that opened up possibilities she had never dared to consider. The Chicago Women's College offered courses in everything from mathematics and science to literature and philosophy. The city boasted several organizations dedicated to women's suffrage and social reform. There were even job advertisements specifically seeking educated women for positions in schools, hospitals, and businesses. One pamphlet particularly caught her attention: the Progressive Academy for Young Women, seeking qualified instructors in mathematics and business administration. The salary listed was more than most men in Millbrook earned, and the description emphasized the school's commitment to preparing women for independent careers. She fell asleep that night with the pamphlets scattered around her, dreaming of classrooms filled with eager young women and ledger books that bore her own signature. Margaret woke to the sound of street vendors calling their wares and the clip-clop of horses on cobblestones. Sunlight streamed through her windows, revealing the garden she had glimpsed the night before in all its autumn glory. Red and gold leaves drifted from oak trees, and late-blooming roses added splashes of color to carefully tended beds. A soft knock announced Mrs. O'Brien with breakfast and the morning newspapers. "Mr. Crawford had to leave early for a court appearance," she explained, "but he asked me to tell you that you're welcome to explore the neighborhood. There's a women's bookstore just 3 blocks north, and the college is only a short walk beyond that." The idea of exploring the city on her own was both thrilling and terrifying. Margaret had never walked through unfamiliar streets without a male escort, but the women she had seen the previous evening had moved with such confidence that she decided to try. She dressed carefully in one of the dresses Mrs. O'Brien had provided, a deep blue wool that fit surprisingly well. Looking at herself in the mirror, she was struck by how different she appeared from the broken woman who had stood in the Henderson parlor just 2 days ago. There was color in her cheeks and a spark in her eyes that had been missing for months. The bookstore was a revelation. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes by authors Margaret had heard of but never been able to read. There were works by female writers, books on philosophy and science, novels that explored ideas far beyond the domestic concerns that had filled her life in Millbrook. The proprietor, a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair, approached with a welcoming smile. "You look like someone discovering a treasure trove. I'm Eleanor Hartwell. This is my shop." Margaret Thompson. "I've never seen so many books in one place." "Are you new to Chicago?" You have that slightly overwhelmed look that newcomers get when they realize how much the city has to offer. Margaret found herself telling Eleanor about her recent arrival, though she kept the details of her circumstances deliberately vague. Eleanor listened with the kind of attention that suggested she had heard similar stories before. "You know," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "I'm part of a women's discussion group that meets here every Tuesday evening. We read books on social issues, politics, philosophy. You might enjoy it. We're always looking for new perspectives." The idea of discussing books and ideas with other educated women was intoxicating. "I would love that. What are you reading currently?" Mary. "Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman." Now it's causing quite a stir among our members. Some find her ideas too radical, others think she doesn't go far enough. Margaret had heard whispers about Wollstonecraft's work, but had never been able to obtain a copy in Millbrook. "I'd very much like to read it." Eleanor handed her a well-worn copy. "Consider it a welcome gift, and please do come Tuesday evening. We start at 7 o'clock. Margaret's next stop was the Chicago Women's College, an imposing brick building that hummed with activity despite the early hour. Students hurried across the courtyard carrying books and portfolios, their faces bright with purpose and ambition. Margaret watched them through the iron gates, remembering her own thwarted dreams of education. "Impressive, isn't it?" Margaret turned to find a young woman about her own age standing beside her. She was dressed in the simple but well-made clothing of a working woman, and her dark hair was pinned back in a practical style. "Very impressive," Margaret agreed. "I was just wondering what it would be like to study here." "It's wonderful, and terrifying and exhausting all at once," the woman said with a laugh. "I'm Sarah Chen. I'm in my final year of the teacher preparation program. Margaret Thompson. I've just arrived in Chicago, and I'm considering my options." Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "If you're thinking about teaching, you should definitely apply. They're always looking for qualified candidates, especially those with practical experience. What's your background?" Margaret found herself explaining her years of helping Robert manage the mill's finances, her love of mathematics, and her dream of teaching other women practical business skills. Sarah listened with growing excitement. "You absolutely must meet Professor Williams. She runs the mathematics department and has been advocating for more courses in practical business applications. She would be thrilled to talk with someone who has real-world experience." Before Margaret could protest that she wasn't ready for such a meeting, Sarah was leading her through the gates and into the building. The hallways buzzed with the energy of learning, students and teachers engaged in animated discussions about everything from literature to science. Professor Williams turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened intently as Sarah introduced Margaret and explained her background. "Mrs. Thompson," Professor Williams said when Sarah finished, "would you be willing to guest lecture for one of my advanced mathematics classes? I have a group of students who are struggling to see the practical applications of the theories we're covering. Someone with your experience might be exactly what they need." Margaret's pulse quickened with a mixture of excitement and terror. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach at a college level." "Nonsense. You have something more valuable than academic credentials, real-world knowledge." These young women need to understand that mathematics isn't just abstract theory. It's a tool they can use to build independent lives. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and intimidating. Margaret had dreamed of teaching, but she had never imagined starting at such a prestigious institution. "Think about it," Professor Williams said, handing her a card. "If you decide you're interested, come back tomorrow and we'll discuss the details." Margaret spent the afternoon wandering through more of the city, visiting shops and observing the rhythm of urban life. Everywhere she looked, she saw women engaged in work that would have been unthinkable in Millbrook. Female clerks managed transactions in department stores, women doctors hurried between medical appointments, and lady journalists scribbled notes as they interviewed subjects on street corners. When she returned to Daniel's house that evening, she found him in his study, surrounded by law books and legal documents. He looked up with a warm smile as she entered. "How was your first day of exploration?" Margaret settled into the chair across from his desk, her mind still buzzing with possibilities. "Overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying. I think I may have accidentally committed to giving a guest lecture at the Women's College." Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise and delight. "That's marvelous. Tell me everything." As Margaret recounted her day, she found herself speaking with an animation she hadn't felt in years. Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement. "You know," he said when she finished, "Robert would be incredibly proud of what you're accomplishing. In less than 3 days, you've gone from being someone's property to being courted by one of the city's most prestigious educational institutions." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "I keep thinking about what you said on the train, about reclaiming my life. I'm beginning to understand what that really means." "What does it mean to you?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. "It means discovering who I am, when no one else is defining my worth. It means using the mind God gave me for something more than keeping house and bearing children. It means honoring Robert's memory by becoming the woman he believed I could be." Daniel's expression was soft with understanding. Catherine would have said something very similar. She believed that every woman deserved the chance to discover her own potential, regardless of society's expectations. "I wish I could have met her. I think you would have been great friends." She had the same courage you're showing, the same determination to create something meaningful from difficult circumstances. As they talked, Margaret felt a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time since Robert's death, she wasn't just surviving from one day to the next. She was planning, dreaming, building something entirely her own. "Daniel," she said, "as the evening grew late, I want you to know that whatever I decide to do, wherever this path leads, I will always be grateful for the gift you've given me. Not just the money, though that's important, but the belief that I'm capable of more than I ever imagined." Daniel smiled, and in that smile Margaret saw echoes of the man who had loved Catherine Walsh, the man who had made it his mission to help other women find the freedom his fiancée had been denied. "Margaret, the gift isn't mine to give. It was always yours. You just needed the right circumstances to unwrap it." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she looked out her window at the gas-lit streets of Chicago and felt the future stretching before her like an open book. Tomorrow, she would return to the college and accept Professor Williams's offer. She would join Eleanor's discussion group and read about women's rights. She would begin the work of building a life that honored both her own dreams and Robert's. Faith in her abilities. For the first time in 7 years, Margaret Thompson was exactly where she belonged, at the beginning of her own story. With the power to write every page that followed, Margaret stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her navy dress for the 3rd time. Today marked her first guest lecture at the Chicago Women's College, and her stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and terror. She'd spent the past week preparing, filling pages with calculations and real-world examples that would demonstrate the practical applications of advanced mathematics. Mrs. O'Brien appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee and a reassuring smile. "Nerves are natural, dear. But remember, Professor Williams chose you for a reason. Those young women need to hear what you have to say." "What if I forget everything? What if they ask questions I can't answer? Then you'll say, 'I don't know, but let's figure it out together.' Sometimes the best teachers are those who aren't afraid to learn alongside their students." The wisdom in Mrs. O'Brien's words helped calm Margaret's racing heart. She gathered her carefully prepared notes and set out for the college, walking through streets that were becoming increasingly familiar. The autumn air was crisp, and the city hummed with its usual energy. At the college, Professor Williams met her at the entrance with barely contained enthusiasm. "My students have been buzzing with curiosity all week. I may have oversold you a bit, telling them about a real businesswoman who understands mathematics in ways their textbooks never could." Margaret's pulse quickened. "No pressure at all," Professor Williams laughed. "You'll be wonderful. Follow me." The classroom contained 30 young women, their faces bright with intelligence and ambition. Some appeared to be Margaret's age or Older, women who had likely struggled to obtain an education despite societal obstacles. Others were younger, fresh-faced and eager, representing a generation that might never have to fight as hard for the opportunities they were being given. "Ladies," Professor Williams announced, "I'm pleased to introduce Mrs. Margaret Thompson, who will be sharing her expertise in practical business mathematics." Mrs. Thompson managed the complex finances of one of Ohio's largest grain mills for 7 years. The introduction felt surreal. For the first time in her life, Margaret's contributions to the mill were being acknowledged publicly, given the weight and respect they deserved. "Good morning," Margaret began, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "How many of you plan to use your education to support yourselves financially?" Nearly every hand in the room shot up immediately. "Excellent. Then you need to understand that mathematics isn't just about solving equations for their own sake. It's about having the tools to navigate a world that will try to convince you that numbers are too complicated for women to understand." For the next hour, Margaret walked the students through real scenarios from the mill, calculating profit margins when grain prices fluctuated, determining optimal inventory levels, managing seasonal cash flow challenges. She showed them how the abstract concepts from their textbooks translated into decisions that affected dozens of employees and thousands of dollars. "The bankers who came to review our books," Margaret explained, "always seemed surprised that a woman understood compound interest calculations. They expected Robert to handle the difficult mathematics while I made tea and took notes. Instead, I was usually the one explaining their errors." The students laughed, but Margaret could see recognition in their eyes. Many had likely experienced similar dismissiveness about their intellectual capabilities. One student, a serious young woman with wire-rimmed spectacles, raised her hand. "Mrs. Thompson, how did you gain your husband's trust in business matters? Many women here worry that even with education, employers won't take us seriously." Margaret considered the question carefully. "Robert trusted me because I proved myself reliable with small responsibilities first. When he saw that I could balance household accounts without errors, he let me help with larger calculations. When I caught a major discrepancy that could have cost us significant money, he began including me in business meetings. Competence speaks louder than prejudice, but you have to be patient and strategic about demonstrating it." Another student asked, "What advice would you give to women who want to start their own businesses?" "Understand every aspect of your finances," Margaret replied without hesitation. "Know your costs, your margins, your cash flow. Don't let anyone else control information that affects your livelihood, and save money whenever possible. Financial independence gives you choices that married women often don't have." The questions continued long past the scheduled end of class. Students crowded around Margaret's desk, hungry for practical wisdom that their academic courses couldn't provide. When Professor Williams finally had to clear the room for the next class, several students asked if Margaret would consider teaching a regular course. "That was extraordinary," Professor Williams said as they walked toward her office. "I've never seen students so engaged. You have a gift for making abstract concepts concrete and relevant." "I enjoyed it more than I expected," Margaret admitted. "There's something wonderful about sharing knowledge with women who genuinely want to learn." "Would you consider a more formal arrangement? I could offer you a position as a lecturer in practical business mathematics. The salary would be quite respectable, and you'd be helping to prepare these women for independent careers." The offer was everything Margaret had dreamed of, but she felt compelled to be honest about her limitations. "Professor Williams, I don't have formal credentials. I never attended college myself." "Mrs. Thompson, you have something more valuable than credentials: experience. These students need to learn from someone who has actually applied mathematical principles in the real world. Your background gives you credibility that no degree could provide." Margaret felt a surge of excitement mixed with trepidation. A formal teaching position would mean committing to staying in Chicago, building a life that was entirely her own creation. May I have some time to consider the offer? Of course, but don't take too long. Word travels fast in academic circles, and I suspect other institutions will be interested in you once they hear about today's success. That evening, Margaret joined Eleanor Hartwell's discussion group for the first time. The bookstore's back room had been arranged with comfortable chairs in a circle, and 8 women of various ages were engaged in animated conversation about Mary Wollstonecraft's revolutionary text. The fundamental question, Eleanor was saying, as Margaret settled into an empty chair, is whether women's supposed inferiority is natural or created by society's limitations on our education and opportunities. A woman in her 20s with fiery red hair leaned forward passionately. It's obviously created by society. Give any woman the same education and opportunities as a man, and she'll prove herself equally capable. An older woman with graying hair shook her head. But Rebecca, we can't ignore biological differences. Women are naturally more suited to nurturing roles. Who? Rebecca shot back. The same society that benefits from keeping us in those roles. Margaret found herself drawn into the debate, despite her initial intention to simply observe. I think the real issue is choice. Some women genuinely prefer domestic life, and they should be free to choose that. But others have different talents and interests, and they should be equally free to pursue those paths. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Margaret raises an important point about individual choice. What does Wollstonecraft say about this? The discussion continued for 2 hours, ranging across topics from women's suffrage to educational reform to economic independence. Margaret discovered that she had strong opinions on subjects she had never been encouraged to think about in Millbrook. More importantly, she found herself among women who valued those opinions and challenged her to refine her thinking. "You'll be back next week, I hope?" Eleanor asked as the group was dispersing. "Absolutely. This is exactly what I didn't know I was missing." Walking home through the gas-lit streets, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary day. She had successfully taught a college class, been offered a formal position, and engaged in the kind of intellectual discourse that fed her soul. For the first time in her adult life, she felt fully engaged with the world around her. Daniel was waiting in the sitting room when she arrived, a brandy in his hand, and legal documents spread across the coffee table. "How did your lecture go?" he asked, looking up with genuine interest. "Better than I could have hoped. Professor Williams offered me a formal teaching position." Daniel's face broke into a wide grin. "That's wonderful. Are you going to accept?" "I think so, but it means committing to building a life here, making Chicago my permanent home. That feels like a big step." Daniel set down his brandy and leaned forward. "Margaret, may I share something with you? When I first came to Chicago, I was running away from the memories of Catherine's death. I thought if I kept moving, kept taking on new cases, I could outrun the pain. But building a life here, putting down roots, connecting with people who shared my values, that's what actually healed me. You think I should take the position? I think you should do whatever feels right for you. But don't let fear of commitment hold you back from something that could bring you genuine fulfillment." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. O'Brien appeared with tea and the evening mail. Among the letters was an envelope that made Margaret's stomach clench. Expensive stationery with the Henderson family crest. "Bad news?" Daniel asked, noticing her expression. Margaret broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the contents twice before looking up. "Patricia is coming to Chicago. She says she has urgent family business to discuss with me." Daniel's expression darkened. What kind of urgent business? She doesn't specify. She just says she'll be arriving next week and expects me to make time for a meeting. "You don't have to see her, you know. Legally, she has no claim on you." "I know, but part of me is curious about what she wants." And another part thinks I should face her from a position of strength rather than avoiding confrontation. Daniel nodded slowly. If you decide to meet with her, I'd like to be present, not to control the conversation, but to ensure she understands the legal realities of your situation. Margaret folded the letter and set it aside. Whatever Patricia wanted, it couldn't diminish what Margaret had accomplished in just 1 week in Chicago. She had found work that utilized her skills, discovered an intellectual community that valued her contributions, and begun building the independent life that Robert had wanted for her. The next morning brought another surprise. A hand-delivered note from the Progressive Academy for Young Women, the private school whose advertisement had caught her attention during her first night in Chicago. Dear Mrs. Thompson, the letter read, we understand from Professor Williams that you have exceptional qualifications in practical business mathematics. We would be honored to discuss a potential position with our institution. Our mission is preparing young women for independent careers, and we believe your experience would be invaluable to our students. Would you be available for an interview this afternoon? Margaret stared at the letter in amazement. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from being a nervous guest lecturer to being courted by 2 educational institutions. Good news? Mrs. O'Brien asked, noticing Margaret's expression. I think my life is about to become more complicated in the best possible way. The Progressive Academy occupied a converted mansion in one of Chicago's most fashionable neighborhoods. Unlike the formal brick structure of the women's college, this building felt warm and welcoming, with large windows that filled the rooms with natural light and artwork that celebrated women's achievements throughout history. The headmistress, Dr. Victoria Sterling, was a woman in her 40s with prematurely silver hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. She welcomed Margaret into her office with genuine warmth. Professor Williams spoke of your lecture with such enthusiasm that I simply had to meet you, Dr. Sterling said. She said her students were more engaged than she'd ever seen them. I found the experience quite rewarding myself. Tell me, Mrs. Thompson, what do you believe is the most important thing we can teach young women about mathematics and business? Margaret thought carefully before responding. That numbers are tools of power. When you understand finances, you can't be cheated or manipulated. When you can calculate profit margins and analyze investments, you can create wealth rather than just spending it. We need to teach women that mathematical literacy is a form of self-defense. Dr. Sterling's eyes lit up. Exactly. Too many schools treat mathematics as an abstract academic exercise. We want our students to understand it as a practical skill that will serve them throughout their lives. The interview continued for an hour, ranging across educational philosophy, teaching methods, and Margaret's vision for preparing women to succeed in business. By the end, Dr. Sterling was leaning forward with obvious excitement. Mrs. Thompson, I would like to offer you a position developing and teaching our business mathematics curriculum. The salary would be quite generous, and you would have complete freedom to design courses that meet our students' practical needs. Margaret felt dizzy with the rapid pace of opportunities presenting themselves. Dr. Sterling, I'm flattered, but I should mention that I may also have an offer from the Women's College. I understand completely. Take the time you need to make the right decision, but I hope you'll consider that here you would be building something entirely new rather than fitting into an existing program. Walking home from the academy, Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. 2 teaching positions, each offering different opportunities and challenges. A discussion group that fed her intellectual curiosity. A city full of women who were redefining what was possible for their gender, and hovering over it all, the specter of Patricia Henderson's impending visit and whatever urgent family business she wanted to discuss. That evening, Margaret sat at her writing desk and began composing letters, one to Professor Williams asking for more time to consider the college position, one to Dr. Sterling requesting additional details about the Academy's expectations, and one to Robert's grave, though she would never send it. "My dear husband," she wrote, "I wish you could see what your love and foresight have made possible. I am becoming the woman you always believed I could be, and I am discovering strengths I never knew I possessed. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I will face them as someone worthy of the sacrifice you made for my freedom." As she sealed the letters, Margaret felt the weight of the decisions before her. But for the first time in her life, they were her decisions to make, and that made all the difference. The knock on Daniel's front door came at precisely 10 o'clock on a grey Tuesday morning, sharp and demanding in a way that made Mrs. O'Brien frown as she went to answer it. Margaret heard Patricia's voice from her sitting room upstairs, that familiar tone of authority that had once made her feel small and insignificant. "I'm here to see Margaret Thompson. I assume she's told you I was coming." Margaret took a deep breath, smoothed her burgundy dress, and descended the stairs with measured steps. The woman waiting in Daniel's foyer looked exactly the same as she had 2 weeks ago, impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed, and radiating the kind of cold disapproval that had dominated Margaret's life for 7 years. "Patricia," Margaret said, calmly, "you mentioned urgent family business. What brings you to Chicago?" Patricia's eyes swept the elegant entryway, taking in the expensive furnishings and obvious signs of wealth. Her expression suggested she was calculating the value of everything she saw. "We need to discuss your situation, Margaret, away from prying ears." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Mrs. O'Brien, who was hovering protectively nearby. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Mrs. O'Brien. She's become a trusted friend." Patricia's lips pursed with irritation. "Very well, Margaret, the family has discovered some irregularities in Robert's estate planning. We believe you may have been involved in financial improprieties before his death." The accusation hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of irregularities?" "Large sums of money transferred to accounts in Chicago, funds that should have remained part of the estate. The family believes you manipulated Robert into making these transfers while he was ill and not thinking clearly." Mrs. O'Brien made a small sound of outrage, but Margaret held up a hand to silence her. "Patricia, are you accusing me of stealing from my own husband? I'm saying that money rightfully belongs to the Thompson family, and we intend to recover it. Unless, of course, you're willing to return voluntarily to Millbrook and submit to proper family oversight." The true purpose of Patricia's visit crystallized with shocking clarity. This wasn't about money at all. It was about control, about dragging Margaret back into a life of dependence and humiliation. "And if I refuse?" Patricia's smile was as cold as winter frost. "We'll be forced to pursue legal action. Fraud charges can be quite serious, Margaret. Even if you're eventually cleared, the scandal would ruin any prospects you might have here in Chicago." Before Margaret could respond, Daniel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Henderson." He stood in the doorway of his study, still wearing his coat from the morning's court appearance. His expression was professionally neutral, but Margaret could see steel behind his eyes. "Mr. Crawford," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how convenient that you're here. Perhaps you can help Margaret understand the seriousness of her situation." Daniel moved to stand beside Margaret, a gesture of support that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Mrs. Henderson, I've reviewed all the financial transactions you're referring to. Every transfer was properly documented and legally executed. Mrs. Thompson had full authority to manage those accounts." Authority given by a dying man who wasn't. In his right mind, authority given by a husband to his wife, which is perfectly legal under Ohio law. Moreover, the accounts in question were established with funds that Robert Thompson had every right to dispose of as he saw fit. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. You can't prove Robert was competent when he made those decisions. Daniel walked to his study and returned with a thick folder. Actually, I can. Robert's correspondence with multiple banks, his meetings with 3 different lawyers, and medical records showing he was fully competent until the day he died. Would you like to review the documentation? The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret watched Patricia's face cycle through surprise, anger, and calculation before settling on cold fury. This isn't over, Patricia said finally. The Thompson family has resources and connections that you can't imagine. We'll find other ways to bring Margaret home where she belongs. Mrs. Henderson, Daniel said quietly, I should inform you that threatening harassment of my client constitutes a criminal offense in Illinois. I strongly advise you to reconsider any future actions against Mrs. Thompson. Patricia gathered her coat and reticule with jerky, angry movements. Margaret, you're making a terrible mistake. This man doesn't care about you. He's using you for his own purposes, just like all men do. When he's finished with you, you'll have nothing. On the contrary, Margaret said, finding her voice at last. For the first time in my life, I have everything that matters. Freedom, purpose, and the respect of people who value me for who I am rather than what I can produce for them. Patricia's departure was swift and bitter, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that seemed to linger in the elegant foyer. Margaret sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Are you all right? Daniel asked, his professional demeanor softening into genuine concern. I think so. I just didn't expect her to be so vicious. The accusations, the threats. Mrs. O'Brien appeared with a steaming cup of tea, her Irish accent thick with indignation. That woman has the devil's own tongue. Pay her no mind, dear. She's got no power over you here. Daniel knelt beside Margaret's chair, his voice gentle but serious. Margaret, I want you to understand something important. Patricia's threats were empty bluster. She has no legal standing to pursue fraud charges, and any lawyer she consulted would tell her the same thing. This was purely an intimidation tactic. But what if she tries something else? You heard what she said about the family's resources and connections. Then we'll deal with whatever comes. But Margaret, you can't let fear of Patricia's machinations control your decisions. That's exactly what she wants. Margaret sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and steady her nerves. You're right. I won't let her drive me back into hiding. The afternoon brought a welcome distraction in the form of a note from Dr. Sterling, inviting Margaret to observe classes at the Progressive Academy. Walking through Chicago's bustling streets, Margaret felt her confidence returning with each step away from Daniel's house and Patricia's poisonous presence. The academy hummed with purposeful energy. In one classroom, young women debated political philosophy with passion and intelligence. In another, students worked through complex mathematical proofs while discussing their real-world applications. Margaret watched through doorways, amazed by the level of intellectual engagement she witnessed. Impressive, isn't it? Dr. Sterling said, joining Margaret in the hallway. These young women will graduate prepared to compete with anyone, male or female, in their chosen fields. It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. Dr. Sterling studied Margaret's face carefully. I hope you'll forgive my directness, but you look troubled today. Is everything all right? Margaret found herself explaining Patricia's visit and the accusations that had been leveled against her. Dr. Sterling listened with growing indignation. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that such tactics are unfortunately common when women attempt to claim independence. Families often resort to intimidation when they realize they're losing control. But you mustn't let them succeed. It's just Difficult to imagine that people who once called me family could be so cruel. Power does strange things to people, especially when they feel it slipping away. But consider this. Would you rather return to a life where such people control your every decision, or build something new where their opinions are irrelevant? The choice, when framed so starkly, was obvious. Margaret had tasted freedom and intellectual fulfillment. She could never willingly return to the suffocating world Patricia represented. Dr. Sterling, I'd like to accept your offer. I want to help build something that prepares young women to face the world with confidence and competence. Dr. Sterling's smile was radiant. Wonderful. We can discuss the details tomorrow, but I'm thrilled to have you join our faculty. That evening, Margaret sat in her room writing a letter to Professor Williams, declining the college position with genuine regret, but explaining her excitement about the Academy's mission. She also began sketching out ideas for the business mathematics curriculum she would develop, her mind racing with possibilities. A soft knock interrupted her work. Mrs. O'Brien peered around the door with a warm smile. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Today was quite an ordeal." "Better, actually. Clearer about what I want and where I belong." Mrs. O'Brien entered the room and settled into the comfortable chair by the window. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you've changed remarkably since arriving here. There's a strength in you now that wasn't there before." Margaret looked up from her writing, surprised by the observation. "Do you really think so?" "Oh, absolutely. When you first walked through that door, you looked like a woman who'd been beaten down by life. Now you carry yourself like someone who knows her own worth." The transformation Mrs. O'Brien described felt real but fragile, as if Patricia's visit had reminded Margaret how easily confidence could be shattered by those determined to undermine it. "Mrs. O'Brien, may I ask you something personal? How did you come to work for Daniel?" Mrs. O'Brien's expression grew thoughtful. "My husband died in a factory accident 10 years ago, leaving me with 2 young children and no means of support. Daniel's law firm helped me sue for compensation, and when I won, he offered me a position managing his household. He said he needed someone who understood what it meant to start over. And your children? Both in college now, thanks to Daniel's generosity and my determination to give them opportunities I never had. My daughter wants to be a doctor, my son an engineer. 20 years ago, such ambitions would have been impossible for children like mine." Margaret felt a new appreciation for Daniel's character and a deeper understanding of why he had chosen to help her. His rescue wasn't an isolated act of charity, but part of a larger commitment to helping women reclaim their lives from circumstances beyond their control. "He really is remarkable, isn't he?" Mrs. O'Brien's smile was knowing. "That he is, and he sees the same remarkable qualities in you, though I suspect you're still discovering them yourself." As the evening deepened, Margaret finished her correspondence and prepared for bed with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but she would face them as someone who had chosen her own path despite the forces arrayed against her. Patricia's visit had been meant to frighten her back into submission, but it had achieved the opposite effect. Margaret now understood exactly what she was fighting against and why the stakes were so high. She was not just building a career or pursuing personal fulfillment. She was proving that women could define their own worth, create their own opportunities, and thrive without the permission or approval of those who sought to control them. The woman who had once stood silently in a parlor while her fate was auctioned to the highest bidder was gone forever. In her place stood Margaret Thompson, educator, independent woman, and living proof that freedom, once tasted, could never be surrendered. 6 months later, Margaret stood at the front of her classroom at the Progressive Academy, watching 25 young women work through complex financial calculations with the kind of focused intensity that made her heart swell with pride. The late spring sunshine streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces bright with determination and possibility. "Miss Patterson," Margaret called to a student struggling with a compound interest problem, "remember that time is your greatest ally in building wealth. Show me how the numbers change when we extend the investment period from 5 years to 20. The girl's face lit up as understanding dawned. "Oh, the difference is enormous. 20 years nearly triples the final amount." "Exactly. This is why women must start thinking about financial independence early, regardless of whether they plan to marry. Your future security depends on understanding these principles." As the class ended and students filed out chattering excitedly about their projects, Margaret gathered her materials with deep satisfaction. She had developed 3 courses now: practical business mathematics, financial planning for independent women, and investment strategies for small capital. All 3 were oversubscribed, with waiting lists of eager students. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, beaming with satisfaction. "Margaret, I have wonderful news. The Chicago Women's Education Alliance wants to feature our business program in their annual report. They're calling it revolutionary and crediting you with pioneering a new approach to women's financial education." Margaret felt a warm flush of pride mixed with amazement. Less than a year ago, she had been auctioned off like livestock. Now she was being recognized as an educational innovator. "There's more," Dr. Sterling continued. "I've received inquiries from schools in Boston, Philadelphia, and even New York. They want to send representatives to observe your teaching methods and potentially hire you to develop similar programs." The scope of these opportunities was breathtaking, but Margaret felt no desire to leave Chicago. This city had given her everything: freedom, purpose, intellectual community, and most importantly, the chance to discover who she truly was beneath years of other people's expectations. "Dr. Sterling, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm exactly where I want to be. These students, this mission, it's become my life's work." Walking home through the familiar streets, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary changes that had transformed her existence. Eleanor's discussion group had become a second family, providing intellectual stimulation and deep friendships. Her students challenged and inspired her daily. Most surprisingly, her relationship with Daniel had evolved into something she hadn't expected to find again: genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Daniel was waiting in the garden when she arrived, pruning roses with the careful attention he brought to everything important in his life. He looked up as she approached, his smile warm with the affection that had grown between them over months of shared conversations, quiet evenings, and the comfortable intimacy of 2 people who understood each other's scars. "How was class today?" he asked, setting down his pruning shears and brushing dirt from his hands. "Extraordinary. I watched young women discover that they have the power to control their financial destinies. It never gets old." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you. I received a letter today from Millbrook." Margaret's stomach clenched involuntarily, even though she had long since stopped fearing Patricia's threats. "What kind of letter?" "Robert's mill is being sold. The new owners want to honor his memory by establishing a scholarship fund for women pursuing business education. They asked if I knew anyone qualified to help administer it." The irony was perfect and painful. The mill where Margaret had worked in shadows for 7 years, where her contributions had gone unrecognized and uncredited, was now going to fund opportunities for other women to claim the recognition she had been denied. They specifically mentioned wanting someone who understood Robert's vision for supporting women's advancement. Daniel continued gently. "Apparently they found letters he wrote advocating for female education. Letters that mentioned you by name." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Even now, months after accepting the reality of his death, Robert continued to surprise her with the depth of his love and foresight. "Would you consider it?" Daniel asked. "It would mean occasional trips back to Ohio, but the work could largely be done from here." The prospect of returning to Millbrook, even briefly, had once filled Margaret with dread. Now she realized that Patricia and the Thompson family no longer had the power to diminish her. She had built something too substantial, too meaningful, for their petty cruelties to destroy. "Yes," she said finally, "I think Robert would want his legacy to support women who are fighting for the same freedoms he tried to secure for me." That evening, as they sat together in the garden watching fireflies dance among the roses, Daniel took Margaret's hand with the tentative care of someone who had learned not to take love for granted. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no pressure behind the question. But I've been thinking about our future, about what we've built together." Margaret's heart began racing, though whether from hope or fear she couldn't say. "We've become partners in so many ways," Daniel continued. "In work, in supporting each other's dreams, in creating a life that honors both our pasts and our hopes for what's possible. I wonder if you might consider making that partnership official." Margaret studied his face in the gathering dusk, seeing vulnerability and hope in equal measure. "Daniel, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you would consider a marriage unlike any either of us has known before. A partnership between equals, where your dreams matter as much as mine, where your work is valued and supported, where you never have to choose between love and independence." The proposal was everything Margaret hadn't known she wanted: recognition of her autonomy, respect for her ambitions, and the promise of companionship without domination. "Yes," she said simply, amazement coloring her voice. "Yes, I would love to marry you." Their wedding 6 weeks later was deliberately unconventional. Instead of a church ceremony focused on obedience and submission, they exchanged vows in Eleanor's bookstore, surrounded by friends who understood that they were witnessing something revolutionary. A marriage built on mutual respect rather than traditional hierarchy. Eleanor served as Margaret's witness, while Sarah Chen from the Women's College stood beside Daniel. Mrs. O'Brien wept happy tears from the front row, and Dr. Sterling beamed with pride at seeing one of her faculty members claim happiness on her own terms. Margaret wore the same burgundy dress she had chosen for confronting Patricia, transformed with lace and flowers into something that honored both her strength and her joy. Daniel's vows spoke of partnership and support, of building a life where both their dreams could flourish. "I promise to love you not despite your independence, but because of it," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the bookstore. "I promise to support your work, celebrate your achievements, and never ask you to diminish yourself for my comfort." Margaret's own vows surprised her with their certainty. "I promise to share my life with you while remaining true to myself. I promise to build something with you that honors both our individual journeys and our shared future. I promise to love you as an equal partner, not as a woman grateful for male protection." The reception was held in the garden behind Daniel's, or house, their house now, with toasts that celebrated both their personal happiness and the broader significance of their union. Eleanor raised her glass to "a marriage that proves love and independence can coexist." Dr. Sterling toasted "a partnership that will inspire generations of women to demand equality in all their relationships." As the evening wound down and guests departed with hugs and promises to visit soon, Margaret and Daniel found themselves alone in the garden where they had spent so many quiet evenings discovering each other's hearts and minds. "No regrets?" Daniel asked softly, pulling her close as they swayed to music only they could hear. Margaret looked up at the man who had rescued her from one life and helped her build another, who had loved her enough to set her free and strong enough to stand beside her as an equal. "Only one," she said with a smile that held no sadness. I regret that it took losing everything to discover who I really was. 3 years later, Margaret received a letter that made her laugh until tears streamed down her face. Patricia Henderson was writing to request financial advice for her daughter, who had decided to pursue a career in business against her mother's wishes. The letter was stiff and formal, but beneath the cold courtesy, Margaret detected something that might have been respect. She never answered the letter, but she did establish a scholarship in Robert's memory, specifically for young women from small towns who dreamed of larger lives. The first recipient was a girl from Millbrook, whose mother worked as a seamstress and whose father had abandoned the family when she was 8. She planned to study mathematics and economics with the goal of starting her own business. Margaret smiled as she signed the scholarship papers, remembering the broken woman who had once stood in a parlor while men bid on her future. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true worth could never be auctioned, only claimed. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that freedom wasn't something granted by others, but something seized by those brave enough to define their own value. And in seizing it, she had discovered that the woman Patricia's family had dismissed as worthless was actually priceless, not as someone's wife or someone's property, but as herself, complete and sufficient and free. Daniel found her that evening, in her study, grading papers by lamplight with the focused concentration that still amazed him after years of marriage. She looked up as he entered, her face bright with the intellectual engagement that had first attracted him to her mind and heart. "Working late again?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk, reviewing applications for next year's program. "We have twice as many qualified candidates as we can accept. That's a good problem to have." Margaret set down her pen and smiled at the man who had helped her build a life beyond her wildest dreams. The best kind of problem. The kind that means we're changing the world, one young woman at a time. Outside their window, Chicago hummed with the energy of progress and possibility. Inside their study, two partners in love and revolution planned how to give other women what Margaret had fought so hard to claim: the right to define their own worth, write their own stories, and carry their own names with pride. She would indeed carry Daniel's name, but on her own terms, as his equal partner in a marriage that proved love could exist without domination. And in classrooms across the city, young women were learning that they too could carry their own names forever, not as someone's property, but as free women capable of anything they dared to dream. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.